Hello, I'm Greg Clinton. In this presentation I'm going to speak with you about the problem, the heart of the research process. The objectives of this presentation are for you to be able to explain the importance of the research problem for conducting a research study, to describe how to identify and state a research problem, to divide the research problem into subproblems, and to explain how to further delineate a research problem. At the heart of every research project is a statement of a problem, and this problem is something that the researcher is attempting to address or to solve. If you've decided that you are going to conduct some research, then it's up to you to clearly identify the problem that your research is going to address. Conducting research is hard work, and therefore the problem you identify should be something that is worth your time and energy. Now, when you begin your quest to identify a problem that you would like to address in your research, it's good for you to be aware of two types of research that almost any project will come under one of these two headings. And the first is basic research. Basic research refers to projects that can advance human knowledge or theories about a particular topic, and this is done for posterity, for a future need, and not for an immediate need. Applied research, on the other hand, refers to projects that can help decision-making about specific practical problems. Now, when I was very new to all of this, I had an opportunity once to talk with an older brother of mine who's a research scientist at the Coweta Forest Service Research Station in western North Carolina. And we were discussing the difference between these two, and I expressed my initial thought that, well, I think applied research ought to be preferred any time. And he turned to me and asked me, why? And so I thought, well, it makes a lot of sense to me that there would be a usefulness for that research right away rather than something that's just sitting on the shelf. And what he pointed out to me is that, yes, this is true, but applied research is often funded by someone who has a particular agenda, and applied research is very susceptible to conflicts of interest. So there is a pros and cons way of looking at this that you want to be aware of. Now, a classic example of applied research would be a testing of a new drug by a pharmaceutical company. Obviously, there is an interest there that tends to be there for those test results to be successful. And in my conversation with my brother, he, being a tree scientist, was much more inclined toward research that didn't have those kinds of strings attached. Research problems should address a question that's important, so that the answer can actually make a difference in some way. We often hear as doctoral students that we shouldn't try to change the world with our dissertation and not to set our aim too high. But at the same time, any research has to have a certain significance. Otherwise, it won't be motivating to you as the researcher. Research problems should advance the frontiers of knowledge. They should be creating new knowledge rather than simply finding what is already out there. Maybe leading to a new way of thinking or a new insight, something like that. Research projects should involve both the collection of data and the interpretation of data. So it isn't simply processing existing data or even simply processing new data that's been collected, but also the interpretation, the looking at the meaning that comes from that collection of data in your project. Your book suggests 4 situations to avoid when considering a problem for research, and the first that they mention is that research projects should not be a ruse for achieving self-enlightenment. It's easy to think about simply going and finding out more about something, and you can do a great deal of this and spend a great deal of time doing this. And the point that the book is making is that we don't want to simply go and benefit from the research of others if we are wanting to call what we are doing research. Research is about creating new knowledge that hasn't been created before, at least not specifically in the way that we do it in our project. And that brings up an interesting point, because when I was in high school, I did my very first paper for one of my English teachers, Miss Hunsucker, as I recall, and that was called a research paper. But what it was this kind of self-enlightenment that the book is talking about. In other words, I went and found out all that I could about a particular topic and wrote about it in a paper. This was called a research paper, when actually it was more of a literature review or synthesis of literature. For our context, for our purposes in graduate school and beyond, research is actually collecting and interpreting data. But I want to say also that I teach school library media graduate students, and in their literature as school library media professionals, the word research is still used in this way, and that's okay for that context, but that's different from our context. We are scholars conducting hopefully original research, and once again, that is more than just simply going out and finding self-enlightenment in some topic and finding out everything that other people have already discovered about that topic. Next, a problem whose sole purpose is to compare two sets of data. That is not a suitable research problem. That is not of sufficient scope. Once again, the research should be a human mind struggling with data. That's the phrase that was used in the book, and that's a good expression for research. Calculating a coefficient of correlation between two sets of data, that is just a procedure. That is not a research problem. A problem that results in a yes or no answer is not a suitable problem. There's not enough scope there for it to be called research. Although I'm not trying to cover every practical application section from the book, the one on this slide I think is certainly worthy of mention, and I hope that you will attend to the other sections that are entitled Practical Application in the book. There's a lot of great material in there. But at the moment, I just want to highlight that these are great suggestions for going and looking. As I mentioned, I have referred to this as a quest to find the topic that you want to do research on. And I think that the last two bullet points here in particular are great suggestions. If you can latch on to a topic that is intriguing and motivating to you, that is the most powerful thing that you can do in solving this quest. Also, if you have a sense that not only does it motivate you, but you think that others will find it interesting when you're done, that's a great formula. When you do find that problem to be addressed, then your next task is to state the problem clearly. This is very challenging for many students. It is a task that we're not familiar with typically, and no matter what else we do, normally the first draft will always need to be refined and in particular shortened. So we need to, not only do we need to think about good writing and how we represent that problem in written form, but also we need to think through the logic of our problem statement. How about the feasibility question? There's a great illustration in the book about a proposal to study the science programs in the secondary schools in the United States. And the author points out that there are some 24,000 or so public and private secondary schools in the country. So there is a real question of scope here. How is the data going to be collected? Perhaps the student thought that a survey could be sent out, and yet is the survey going to be sent to all of these schools because that's what's identified in the problem statement? Maybe the student thought he was going to survey just the school districts. Even in that circumstance, the cost of postage and etc. for actually conducting the research is probably more than this student realizes. And therefore, a corollary to this is that you should say just what you mean to say. Honesty is assumed in your problem statement and in all of your writing as a researcher. When discussing the problem statement, what this means in particular is that you should not state something that you do not intend to fully carry out. So thinking through the logic and the feasibility, the scope of the problem is a necessary ingredient here at this very early stage. And of course, once again, the editing of your work can sharpen those thoughts and make your communication clear. What this is that you want to accomplish, what this task is that you want to do for your research. Now, at this point, I want to address one area of potential confusion, and that is the use of the word problem in the expression problem statement. You know, ideally, all of our research should address a real problem, a meaningful problem that needs attention. And I've given a couple of examples in this slide. But when you write your problem statement, the function of that problem statement is not to give this description of the crying need that's out there that your research is going to help address. Really, the function of the problem statement is more like a math problem. In other words, what is it that you are about to tackle as a researcher? I think that an alternate name for this that might be apt would be the researcher's task statement. What is it that the researcher has set out to accomplish in this project? And of course, the background about the larger significance of this issue to society can be covered in the introductory material and or the literature review of your proposal. Now that we've arrived at the point where we've identified a research problem and we've made the best effort we can in writing it down clearly, we have to look and see whether the research problem can be divided into subproblems. And in so doing, or in the process of looking at subproblems, we need to watch out for the pitfalls of distinguishing subproblems from what the book calls pseudo-subproblems. And pseudo-subproblems are things that are probably individual steps in your work as you go about or as you plan to actually conduct this research. But not all of these individual tasks or steps that we think of in our work are really part of the research question, because many times they're simply procedures to be carried out or logistical things to solve. For example, what is the best way to choose the sample for this research? Who are going to be the research participants? Another problem that we would certainly characterize as a problem might be where am I going to get the money to provide some incentive for my participants so that I can get some quality participation in this particular study. So those are problems to be solved along the way, but they are not part of your research problem. Thus, the actual subproblems, each of them needs to be a completely researchable unit. Each subproblem is, in a real sense, a piece of research, so it's a part of the whole. Each subproblem should clearly be tied to the interpretation of the data, and the subproblems must add up altogether to the addressing of the overall research problem that you've identified. And there should not be too many subproblems. If you end up with a rather long list of subproblems, then either you have a study that is much too large in scope, or you have probably some pseudo subproblems hiding in there in your list. The book gives some tips about identifying subproblems, and one of the illustrations in the book is with the problem given in the slide that you see here. This is a proposal to study the motets of Palestrina and to compare the counterpoint in those motets with the motets of William Byrd. One of the suggestions that the book makes is taking a paper and pencil approach, writing or copying the problem out, probably printing it out with double-spaced lines, and then going back through, reading it critically, looking for the subproblems and making boxes around them and doing a little diagramming. Then you can rearrange the entire problem according to what you have seen. And then they make a great suggestion to, with the subproblems, look for things that are going to be analyzed or discovered or compared. Those are keywords that you can try to make sure are involved in your subproblems so that you can avoid any lurking pseudo-subproblems that might be trying to emerge. So you can use pencil and paper as a bit of a cognitive tool to help you work on the identifying of subproblems. What I like to do is the book's second suggestion, which is to use brainstorming software. I have used inspiration software for a number of years now, and I find it to be a very useful tool just for brainstorming. When I get ready to write a paper or to come up with a research project or simply any other kind of brainstorming, I can use this kind of tool to create a diagrammatic map, initially just a sketch of ideas and their relationships to each other. Inspiration creates little oval bubbles that of course can be changed into whatever shape you want, but it has a mode that you can go into where you just continue to type and hit enter and lay out all the ideas on different parts of the page one by one, after which you can go back and do the organizing. Well, with the kind of situation that we're talking about here, you might not do that much brainstorming, but you may want to take a text that you have typed out and start to separate it into different boxes and to organize it. So the proposal that you see on the slide here does lend itself to breaking down into component parts. And the book gives you an illustration of how this might look, which we'll take a look at on the next slide. Here I've taken the problem statement and moved it over to the left, and on the right there's a little map that breaks this apart and clarifies what's involved with the problem. One thing you'll notice is that we took the idea of contrasting the work of these two composers, and we recognize that there is an analysis to be done for each one. So therefore we have an analysis to do on Palestrina and an analysis to do on William Byrd. That is the key to making a good map of what's going to be involved to tackle this research problem. So there's subproblem 1, which is to do the Palestrina analysis and to discover those characteristics of his counterpoint. Then there's subproblem 2, which is to do the same kind of analysis of William Byrd's motets and to describe the characteristics of his counterpoint. And then finally, subproblem 3 is to determine what a comparative study of these two analyses may reveal. Now, you may have thought that we were done with the research problem at that point, but in fact there is further to go. We've established the goal for the research with our problem statement, and we've looked at subproblems. But now we need to try to eliminate any possibility of misunderstanding. One of the things we need to do is to state the hypotheses and/or the research questions. These items arise out of the problem statement. Then we also need to delimit the research. We need to define any terms, and we need to state the assumptions that are there behind our work. Hypotheses and research questions are ways to take the research problem and to translate it into specific outcomes that you as the researcher are looking for. Hypotheses are essential to experimental research, generally associated with quantitative research, whereas research questions are more common in qualitative research. Both provide guidance for the kinds of data that the researcher should collect, and they suggest how the analysis should go forward with that data, or with those data. Hypotheses are tentative propositions. They're set forth to assist in guiding the investigation of a problem or to provide possible explanations for the observations made. A hypothesis is an outcome that will be tested for with the research. And when you're dealing with experimental research, there is the hypothesis, what you're trying to look at, but there's also the null hypothesis, which is to say, maybe there will be no effect, or maybe there will be no detectable difference in the thing that you're trying to measure from the before and after, or in comparison to the control group, or that kind of thing. So we have the sort of a positively stated hypothesis that the researcher puts out there, but then when we actually process and run our statistical analyses of the data, we'll be testing for the null hypothesis. If the null hypothesis has not been disproven, then we have failed to give any evidence that our other hypothesis is true. So we default back to the null hypothesis, which is that there's nothing really, there's no effect, or there's no particular difference in the things that we're trying to measure. The research also needs to be delimited. We talked a little earlier about the issue of scope. And when we delimit our research project, we specify really what the boundary is between what we're going to try to accomplish and what is outside of that boundary. There's a great graphic in the book that illustrates the area of research in this illustration, the Palestrina and William Byrd study. So you see in the circle in the middle there is the area of interest, which is contrapuntal writing of these composers in this period of time. But other questions may indeed arise during the work. Did Palestrina and Byrd ever meet personally? What is the evidence whether they did? Is there a record that they did, or is there evidence that they did or not? Did Palestrina and Byrd influence any of their contemporaries? And that's a whole other question that could be looked at with great detail. So these items may become tempting during the research study, but we have to make sure that we have a plan to exclude them so that we can deal with the extensive work that's already there within the scope that we've defined. The limits of the problem should be carefully bounded. Inevitably, in our research proposal, there will be terms that we introduce that are specific to what we are trying to accomplish and that have a technical or at least a very specific meaning. We need to define those terms for the benefit of the reader to make sure that we are communicating clearly. The way we talk about defining terms is we say we define them operationally, and that means we define them in relation to the research, or in how that term is used in the carrying out of the research. Now, a formal definition contains the term itself, the genera, which means the general class to which the concept belongs, and the differentia, the specific characteristics or traits that distinguish that concept from other members of the general category that it belongs to. Now, genera is the plural of the word genus, so that might possibly be a memory cue for you as you're remembering this material. When we learned biology years ago, we learned the classification of living things as kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And that is a more specific meaning than what we mean here. But here we are talking about a general class of things. Now, for example, in our Palestrina and William Byrd study, we talked about contrapuntal writing. Well, what is contrapuntal writing? Contrapuntal writing is the term itself, and it is a manner of composing melody, and that is the genera. A manner of composing melody in which multiple distinct melodies are combined in such a way as to produce a desirable series of harmonies while retaining the individuality of each melodic line. And there we've given the differentia, or the specific characteristics that distinguish this melodic concept from others. And in composing music, we talk about homophony, which is a way of composing melody just with an accompaniment. So essentially there's one melody. And then there's polyphony, which involves more than one melody, and which is another word for counterpoint. counterpoint and contrapuntal writing mean the same thing. Now, we are also warned or cautioned in the book to avoid circular definition. And what if we said that harmonic characteristics, for example, which is another term we've used, is something like those characteristics that derive from the harmonic patterns found in the work of a particular composer. The problem with that definition is that we're trying to define harmonic characteristics, but we've used the word characteristic and the word harmonic in the definition. So we really have added very little to the understanding of whoever would be reading this. That would be sort of like saying, what is a rendezvous? Well, a rendezvous is a meeting place. And then you look up what is a meeting place, and you say a meeting place is a rendezvous. Most circular kinds of definitions are more subtle than that and would probably escape detection more easily than that one would. But that is the idea of a circular definition. Since research is, in a real sense, a quest for truth based on evidence, we might be tempted to think that assumptions in research are a bad thing. But they're not. They're actually a good and normal thing in research. Research couldn't really exist without them, but they do have to be stated. This is a part of the forthrightness that is expected of you as a researcher. All assumptions that have a material bearing on the problem should be openly and unreservedly set forth. So one needs to ask, what am I taking for granted with respect to the research problem? For example, looking again at our Palestrina and William Byrd study, we see that the concept put forth in the research proposal is to look at the motets that they composed when they were of similar age. But those compositional periods actually take place in different periods of years because these men were not born at exactly the same time. So there's an assumption that the motets they wrote between the ages of 50 and 55 can be validly compared to each other. But perhaps this is not a good assumption. There were different things happening historically during those times when they were of these ages, so these things might have had an influence on their music, and perhaps that should bear more strongly on our concept for the research than the specific similar age between the two men. And finally, this is the order in which the topics should generally run in a research proposal. You should begin with the problem statement and follow with subproblems, hypotheses, and or questions, research questions, presented in a logical order. Then you should describe the setting of the problem, including a statement of delimitations, definitions of terms, assumptions, and a statement about the importance of the study. Finally, you should continue with a discussion of investigations that others have done. This is the literature review that is essential for any research proposal. And in closing, the research problem is the core of the research project. The research problem should be identified and stated clearly. The research problem can typically also be divided into subproblems, and further delineation of the problem should include stating the hypotheses or research questions, delimiting the research, defining terms, and stating assumptions. And all of this is presented in the context of a logically sequenced research proposal that includes a review of related literature.